So the animation landscape. So we've all seen how media, entertainment, technology are evolving and the speed at which things are changing. These are affecting content consumption, segmentation, channel proliferation, and deal making. What are the trends in animation techniques, formats, targets, viewing, acquisitions, and how can we spot future trends? That's a lot. That will be, the majority of that will be in the export toolkit, but let's have a quick look now. Could you put the next slide on, please? So this is very blurred, and sorry about that. This is the all new media universe. Broadcast, the term broadcast is now being replaced by the term media, entertainment and technology, or the MET. Life got complicated in the past few years. Diversification, multiplication, segmentation, bundling. You're hearing all those terms all the time. But there are loads of new opportunities for content creators. And this is the universe. These are the guys you have to know to understand in order to explore new opportunities. Next slide, please. So this slide portrays how technology has evolved from analog to digital over decades, and then from digital to connected and now to virtual in just a matter of years, and how things are accelerating. Things are moving fast, and content providers, creators, and platforms are having to evolve to keep up. Viewers are watching TV on mobile devices, whereby one touch of the home button takes them to another channel, games, apps, social media, and the limitless internet. So nowadays, the competition is not just other TV, it's everything. Next slide, please. I love this graph. This is a snapshot of a global internet consumption in just 1 minute, and a comparison between the entire year of 2019 and the figures from January to June of 2020. Of course, the majority of that was during the beginning of lockdown and the beginning of the pandemic. It's a bit difficult to get your head around these figures, or perhaps you can't see them on the screen. So to give you a few examples, and within 60 seconds, there were 4.3 million views or videos viewed on YouTube in 2019, and 4.7 million in that 6-month period in 2020, just as a comparison. 3.7 million Google search requests in 2019 and 4.1 million in 2020. So, and I can't imagine what it looks like for the whole year of 2020, but it's just mind-blowing, that amount of content and eyeballs on different platforms. Next slide, please. So this constantly changing, or the tech revolution has meant increased viewing on more devices. Competition is fierce in terms of content and platforms, and audience ratings have been scattered into thousands of tiny pieces. There's been a total explosion of content produced for and consumed by kids on mobile devices in form of games, shorts, clips, etc., and produced by kids themselves. SVODs and AVODs are taking over the marketplace in terms of viewership. But Viva Animation, this is, although it's complex and a little bit bewildering, this is a really great time to be a content creator, and I truly believe that. Next slide, please. So this is where I might be asking Andrew and Natalie to jump in a little bit. How has the changing Met universe and evolving tech affected deal making? Well, things certainly did get a lot more complicated in the past 10, 15 years. The diversity of rights more complex, and the number of potential partners to handle these rights more numerous. There's an incredible rights grab, and chain of title is extremely important, as we discussed a little bit earlier. Beware the competitor channels clause. This could actually prevent you from doing more deals in a particular territory. And as producers or content creators, you don't have to think that this will be handled by distributors or whoever's going, or your sales agents. These are the things you have to think about right now when you're putting together the financing of your property, as when you're putting together your partnerships. If an investor is asking for exclusivity for a territory, then they should be paying for it. We've had to redefine definitions. Know your VODs, know your SVOD, AVOD, and what they mean, and how they should be defined. General terms and conditions are also negotiable now, and protect yourselves with potential spin-offs, prequels, sequels, renewals, and also success should be rewarded in terms of potential renewals. Think about a budget. When you're planning your budget for animation, think about your budget for additional content creation. You'll be expected to create more content by investors, notably by broadcasters, to support the feature or series online. So think about making ofs, thinking about games, apps, and factor this into your budget. Think about economies of scale. It's going to be a whole lot more expensive to make it afterward. Licensing, merchandising, publishing, and gaming, all important factors if you have a potential brand. Maybe Andrew, you can speak to that, or if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, generally, the more platforms there are, the more competition there is. Usually, the less the traditional broadcasters are able to pay. So, you know, back in the old days when I was a lad, then, you know, a commission from a UK broadcaster for an animated series was a fully funded commission. And now that is just never going to happen. You know, the SVODs and the bigger kind of, you know, international players will do that, but what it means is the skill as a producer is not just about creating lovely content and wonderful stories. It's about pitching, being a salesman, but being aware of the rights and the kind of the contractual landscape around you, and being able to fit that jigsaw together. And you'll talk a little about later about some of the opportunities, but all of those opportunities need to fit together properly. You can't have a position where a deal in one territory, which you think is just for that territory, ends up requiring a whole back against another territory that kills the other part of your deal. You really do have to look at things all together. And if you don't have the skills to do that yourself, you need to surround yourself with people who can do so for you, whether it's a lawyer, an accountant, a co-production expert like yourself, Justine. It's about finding the people who can help you navigate that landscape, because everything is getting increasingly complex. And so, whereas it used to be just, it's a territory deal, now, as you were saying, it's all the individual rights. And so many of the deals now are going into exhaustive detail about all the individual ways you could potentially exploit that content. And you need to be across it, and you need to understand what you're agreeing to.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really important to say. And I think anybody thinking that they might not be able to afford any kind of consultant in legal affairs or a lawyer, I would definitely invest in one, because they're worth their weight in gold, and it will pay off in the long run. Thank you. So next slide, please. So we're going to have a quick look at trend spotting. There are a huge amount of trends. This could be a whole day's workshop. I just wanted to pick out a couple and then talk about spotting future trends. We've talked about target age trends, and there are definitely a huge demand in the bridging target for kids 5 to 8 year olds. For tweens, who are very difficult to cater to, and they are watching shows for older kids. They're watching shows on Netflix like Riverdale and Stranger Things that are not necessary for them, that are scary and have content that's not right for them. So finding that age appropriate or catering to them has been very difficult. It's not really a trend, because comedy has always been in demand and always will be. We're seeing more shorter, I think this is especially for the SVODs, shorter seasons in terms of series, animated series, 9-10 episodes, and serialization, so a softer arc even. Content creation, lots of hybrid shows out there. And before we talk about VR or AR, I think that Kate and Animation UK will have some sessions coming up specifically catering to that. Of course, themes in vogue are anti-bullying, empathy, saving the planet, and diversity with the advent of Black Lives Matter. Can we have the next slide, please? So some future trends coming up. There's, let's have a look, augmented I just touched on, tween safe content, esports, absolutely gigantic, and voice technology is very, very important in terms of trends. I don't know, Natalie, perhaps you might have a couple to add in there, or anything to say to trends, how important that might be for you when you're making a show?
I think it's just always important that you try to stay ahead of the curve. So again, it comes down to just making sure that you're aware of new technologies that are coming through. Innovation is always key. It is a competitive market. Whilst there's more opportunities for content and more players on the scene, that doesn't mean that it is any less competitive. And I think it's always about making sure that you're kind of putting your head above the parapet and there is something very distinct and unique about your properties, more likely that you're going to get picked up if you can offer something new. And I think, you know, kids are exceptionally sophisticated, and, you know, across digital devices and everything else, they're intuitive and they're engaged in a different way. We need to be making sure that we are following the way that they now consume and engage with media in the present, and not be traditionally modeling content creation on how we were doing it 20 years ago. And I think that's critical.
Okay, yeah, absolutely brilliant. And also we're seeing traditional broadcasters who are actually using social platforms, social media, to launch shows or create shows. And we've seen that with NRK in Norway, for example, and their wonderful show Scum, which was launched on Instagram. And that's been extremely important, to going where the kids are and finding different ways to actually find ways to get content to them, and they'll be looking at. Next we have I think that's the recap. I can't see any questions at all in the Q&A function. Does anybody have any questions? Absolutely not, which either means everyone's really shy or we're covering this extremely well. Hopefully. Okay, let's move on to the next slide then. Business of animation, an overview. We're going to have a look at financing and co-pros very briefly, and finding the right partners, and some more groundwork and prep to be done. So finding the right partners, who's appropriate, do you have a complementary skill set, have you researched, and have you researched the platforms? Next slide, please. So before we start discussing putting the money together, please note, and the majority of you already know, that every single financing structure for every single property is different, and this is just one possibility that also dates back quite a while now. It's very traditional. So on the left, you've got a model of a traditional financing structure with broadcasters, and on the right is the IP ownership that corresponds to this particular financing structure. This has been divvied up accordingly, like you divide up a pie or a pizza, and what you put in as an investor is what you get out, generally speaking. And the biggest piece of the pie generally gets the first recoupment on investment, generally speaking. This particular model is probably for a big brand, as having a toy master or a master toy deal on board at the financing stage is quite unusual these days. And for them to put money in and take equity and a share is also very unusual. Andrew, have you seen one of these models recently, or is that a thing of the past?
Well, I mean, in terms of ownership, I think if anything, there are now more pieces to the pie, and they're smaller. Obviously, it depends on the deal you're doing, but you know, one of the changes, I guess, is that with the rise of the SVODs, you know, quite often the pie is 100% to the SVOD. There is no distribution, for example, that they're taking all rights internationally. But on an average series where you have this mosaic of financing, then yes, absolutely, you know, the pie will be split up, and the kind of determining factor is yes, the finance and what you put in, but actually also potentially it's affected by the co-production structure you put in place, because some of the treaties actually require specific ownership structures that mirror particular parts of the financing plan. So you wouldn't now get a project where, unless you're very lucky, where you as the producer or the creator of the IP own everything apart from a small slice, and yet someone gives you the money to make the series or the film. So it is always about giving away ownership, but making sure that what you get in return, be it financing or a co-producer or a broadcast platform, is appropriate for what you're giving away. And that, you know, hopefully at the end of the day, you have a finance project and there's still a little bit left for you.
Okay, and do you have a word to say on gap financing or private investment?
Yes, I mean gap financing, essentially gap financing is financing that comes in right at the end of production, when you've got your broadcaster, your distributor, your traditional sources of revenue, and you're still left with a gap, as the name would suggest. And the problem with gap financing is that it's the last piece of your jigsaw when everything else is in place. And in a way, it's therefore the most important, because that's the thing that greenlights your show. And the problem is therefore that the gap financiers, they tend to be last in, but they're first out. And their deal terms can often be worse than money you've had previously. But it's an essential part of your financing. And part of the gap financing is usually based on who your partners are. So who your distributor or your sales agent is, and how well can they sell, and how much of the territories are still left unsold for them to essentially provide gap against. So it's not just a question of doing deals willy-nilly. You have to look at the balance, and sometimes you might not want to close pre-sales in every single territory worldwide, nice though it is, because you've got nothing left to sell. It's sometimes a balance between getting key territories and then going, okay, the rest we will leave as either as a minimum guarantee or a sales advance or as a gap finance, because we need something to show that we can raise some more money.
And also difficult to find a sales agent or a distributor if you've sold too many territories,
especially the big ones, because ultimately, a sales agent is in business, and they want to make sure that they have the best projects and they have relationships with key buyers. And if they're representing a project, they want to go to their key buyers. They don't really want you to have gone there beforehand and either sold it to a competitor or disrupted the relationship they already have in place. And you may not have got a deal that is as good as they would have got, but by then it's too late. So it is very much about relationships and planning these things.
Okay, well, if you can stay on a little bit, if we can have a look at the next slide, because I wanted to talk a little about newer funding structures and also global buyouts, which don't really exist much these days. And it's also a huge undertaking. You might be invited to come in as a showrunner or creative consultant, but it might mean compromising everything and all the creative control on your show. I haven't seen one of these for a long time. I don't know about you, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, it depends where you're at. So as a producer with a production company, I don't want a buyout. I want to be in a position where I'm making the show. That's kind of what I do now. But if you're a writer or you're an author or you're coming up with IP, actually a global buyout is fantastic. It's brilliant, because suddenly, instead of a producer taking 3 to 15 years to finance your show, somebody is going, great, we'll give you all the money. The big question, as you've highlighted, is that creative control. But equally, in every structure, the further away you are from the finance, the less of a creative control you're allowed to have. If you're the writer, that's fantastic, but ultimately it's the guy in a grey suit who's writing the check who will sign off on it. So there's always a compromise between money and creative control. But I would say it's about what kind of a business you want to run and how you want to operate. If you are very much a producer, then you want to produce. If you're a writer, it's less of an issue about who's producing it, because you want to just write. And if you're an animation studio, you want to be an animation studio, you want to do the animation. And so it really is about thinking about what you want out of a deal, and therefore who's the ideal partner for you.
Absolutely. And as a first-time creator, if it is your first show, then it's all about creating a track record, credibility. So maybe that is the way to go, and compromise that, relinquish creative control, and get it made and get one under your belt, and then go out into the wide world with your next project.
Well, it is, and having that credit and having that experience is really, really important. And sometimes I've been on a project where we've made a decision that we're going to make less money on the project, but green light it straight away. We're going to have to tighten our belts, defer fees, just make it for what we have, but get it into production, because there is there's a big difference between being in production and going around the market saying, hey, I'm in production on this show, and here's my new one, rather than going around saying, well, I haven't made anything, but I've got a great script. And it is about building that credit list and that experience, and people getting to know that you can do stuff. So it is, as you said, sometimes there is a good decision, which is, let's just get this thing made, even if it's not my ideal deal structure.
And on the SVODs, I come across a lot of producers who have tunnel vision about the be all and end all being doing a deal for as a Netflix original, and it can actually be a double-edged sword.
Yeah,
you know, and I think people don't think about the number of language versions that they'll have to create, which could cost
indeed.
them between 500 and $500,000 and $1 million. You know, it's very expensive depending on your cast and crew. And what's interesting now is seeing the emergence of new SVODs are in a few territories, but they will be rolling out, like HBO Max, Amazon Kids Plus, Hulu potentially, and Peacock. It's an incredible amount of competition. They're all very different. And in your experience, I mean, is there a better way to? There are lots of different types of deals with these guys. It's not just about originals. It could also be a straight acquisition deal or even a co-production. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it really does depend. And sometimes there is a strategy which is, you know, rather than going to an SVOD and going, I have no other territory sold worldwide. I'm just pitching you this because I want to get my show away. If you want to get them to agree a particular structure, or you prefer a particular structure, it's easier and sometimes more attractive for them if you already have some other pieces of the pie in place. So if you go to you know, Netflix, for example, and you say, well, I've already got a deal in place for the UK with a major UK broadcaster, it's not as ideal for them because they want the world, but equally the fact you have this little broadcaster on board means it costs them less. And also it's almost a validation of your idea, that actually it's a really good idea. You've got people interested and they were going, oh, this is really interesting. Someone else has bought it as well. So it's not just us. And it de-risks it slightly. And it does give you more flexibility if you know you have somebody else in the chain already. And, you know, they have their own deal terms. And so it's not just one commissioner for the whole world. There's suddenly two, which means nobody actually can say they have full control, and there's a room in the middle for you to be able to run the production properly.
Absolutely. I was also thinking about brands and having a pre-existing brand and it actually that exists elsewhere. There is awareness elsewhere, and the Netflix deal on top of that, or an Amazon deal, has been beneficial. I'm thinking of Peppa Pig most notably, where it's really actually had but for actually starting out and doing your first deal with Netflix, it's not necessarily the ideal place to go for a brand, for a kids brand with licensing potential, as you don't really know what's going on. You don't have any viewership, you don't get any stats, and licensing fraternity might not follow you in that choice. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, some of the information that we do get out of Netflix is, and I'm sure this applies to the other SVODs as well, is that there is often a real peak in your audience when you launch a new series, and there's a massive spike and everyone is watching it and it's fantastic, and 4 weeks later it's gone. Nobody's watching it anymore. And a traditional broadcaster who will do a new episode every day or every week and repeat it several times, your series is on air for 6 months, and you know, for licensing, that's a much more sustainable model. So it really is. It depends on your project. If you think there's going to be huge licensing appeal, then you know, you have to think really carefully about whether an SVOD is the right platform for you to start with, or whether you manage to get it financed and then you sell it into an SVOD at a later date on an acquisition deal, which is a limited period of time and possibly even non-exclusive.
Mm-hmm. I think we're going to have to move on, and I'm being told we're taking too much time on this, but it's absolutely fascinating, super important. It's what producers want to know about, I think. Crowdfunding, I was just going to say a quick word on that and how complicated and laborious and time-consuming and difficult it is unless you have a pre-established fan base. Pilot schemes, thank goodness, are now defunct pretty much, especially where a pilot would have been made, a show would have gone online as a pilot, test run for 20 days, 21 days, and then the plug pulled on it if it didn't work out. So this is something that really doesn't exist as far as I know anymore. But there is just so to give everybody an idea of all those different possibilities in terms of funding and financing. And the traditional route often is the best, although quite complex to put together and time consuming. I see we have a question on IP that we might be able to come back to at the end of the session, so we can move on to the rest of the module because we're not even halfway through it. So the business hour, I just wanted to have a quick look, and I'll be putting in graphs and stats on the on the SVODs and how much they're spending, what their subscribership is looking like, and how they've been booming over the pandemic period. And also the new kids on the block in the last few months. Things are changing so fast. We've seen the emergence of Peacock. HBO Max is taking a much more aggressive position, Apple TV, and also Amazon, who'd stopped really in the kids space and now are back with Amazon Kids Plus, only in a few territories, but rolling out. In terms of spending on content, this is the graph here is actually for across all types of content, but we have got some stats on how they're spending in terms of animation. Netflix is by far the most dynamic of the SVODs in terms of animation, spending $1.1 billion on originals in 2019. So that's a while ago now, and they've increased their actual content in terms of in animation by 50% in 2020 and now in 2021. So you can imagine that budget is exploding. The $1.1 billion was more than Disney's budget for animation in 2020. But Disney Plus, Disney Star, I think that's going to be changing. It's absolutely fascinating to see how things are evolving in that space and how many opportunities are open to producers of features and series for all ages on these platforms, and how they differentiate. Can we have the next slide, please? So finding the right partners, how do you choose your partners? Well, the answer to that is very, very carefully. Do background checks if you can. I'm not saying hire a like private detective or anything, but ask around very discreetly in the business amongst your peers. If you're vetting a studio, look at who has worked with them, ask about their experience with working with them. Where and how do you find a partner? Well, by attending different markets and sessions and festivals, and doing a bit of research, looking at the trade magazines, look at different co-production opportunities, and look at we were saying just now about approaching the SVODs and the different platforms. You might not have those relationships, you might not even know who to approach. And probably a good way, if you're starting out, is to look at the co-producers and the studios in key territories, because they have the relationships, they know the funding systems, and they'll help leverage key partnerships with broadcasters and platforms. Look at your property and its target age group. I'm obsessed with target age groups. And then research the producers who excel in this domain. Look at the animation technique that you're going to be working with. Think about potentially, if it's in 2D, then maybe contact the guys at Toon Boom and ask who's making what and where. They have the finger on the pulse. They know who's doing well, who the great studios are, and who might have a gap in terms of work. Are you and your partners compatible? Look at compatibility in terms of animation, writing, post-production, sales. Try not to double up. Think about complementary skill sets. And what is your partner getting out of this relationship? Pick partners who are and will be incentivized. Pick partners who care about the property and who believe in its potential. It really is important. There are incredible tax credits and incentives all over the world, and some closer to home than you may think. Ireland, Scotland, regional funding in the UK, Belgium, those incredible tax credits of 50% in the Canary Islands, for example. Check out the trades, see who's doing what and who they are partnering with. Next slide, please. So this is about investigating different partners in different territories. This is a slide on France. All of these shows either originated from France, were made in France, or partly animated in France, majority animated in France. It's important that if you're picking a working relationship, you know who the key players are in each of the territories. I think the DIT can help you out in this, and also the different trade organizations within those territories, and also by attending markets and building relationships with producers and studios. Have the next slide, please. There are just a few logos. This is still in France, looking at their actual marketplace. Who's their competition? Where are they positioned? So when you're talking to broadcasters, you're a little bit aware of their marketplace. You're not just going into a vacuum of a conversation, not knowing what they're up against, who their competition is. You need quite a lot of background. And it's very important for you to know this when you're going to meetings, or to at least have an idea. That's just France. So imagine the rest of the world, or the key territories that you'll be looking at working with. I'd highly recommend doing that. Have the next slide, please, Leo. So this lovely lady is Claire Heinrich from France Television. And actually, this is something, a sheet I put together that I actually stole from Kidscreen. They have a global pitch guide, which they bring out every single year. The new one is online, I believe now. It's a wonderful resource if you're looking for information on broadcasters or different partners. This is something that I took from that, I built on it, and I use it when I'm working with matchmaking, for example. I did this one for Telefilm Canada for Annecy. It's great to have a picture on as well when you're doing in real life meetings, if you don't know the person, if you haven't met them. And also I speak to the broadcasters and investors and find out more information about what they're looking for, what's working on their platforms, how to get in touch, which markets they're attending, and all the key information. It's wonderful research. It's a fast track, of course, for clients who I'm working with, but it's something that you can add into. It's really useful. A lot of work again. Anyway, can I have the next slide, please? So just to recap on the business, we had a look at different financing funding models with Andrew, thinking about finding partners, knowing and researching your producers in different territories and the platforms. I don't see any questions. Maybe we can answer Richard Johnson's question, and maybe Andrew can address this if you can see it in the Q&A. The first split of IP. Say with a co-production partner, should you share the rights 50-50 or 49-51 or 50-50 in other industries is often seen as a poor deal. Well, what do you think, Andrew?
The answer is always, it depends. If you're in a situation where it's a very early development, where both parties are going to be putting money in to develop the project and get it to market, and then you're both going to be raising financing, sometimes 50-50 works brilliantly. The question is always 50-50 of what? And so, you know, it might be that you say during development it's 50-50, and then when you start production, it's in line with a financing plan or a co-production deal. It might be that actually it's 50-50 after all of the financing has been recouped and all the third-party payments have been made. It really does depend. In terms of, is it better to have 49-51 or 50-50? I would normally, irrespective of what the percentage is, actually say who has the final say. So what is the process you're going to work through creatively and financially? And then what if you don't agree, who has the final say? And sometimes that's down to the fact that you might have a financing partner, a broadcaster, for example, who's paying for development, and they might be the final arbiter in terms of, is that character blue or orange? You know, if you can't agree between you. But usually I would say the originating partner would say, okay, we'll do it together, but if you're coming on board to my project, so if we can't reach agreement, I have final say. But I wouldn't normally split it 49 or 51. It's either a partnership or it's not. So I would normally go with 50-50 because it's a relationship and both parties need to feel invested in it. If you say you're on 49, psychologically, it makes them feel like this isn't a real partnership.
Thank you, Andrew. I hope that's answered your question, Richard. And we have a question from Edward. Why is a specific target audience a big deal for you? Well, it's a big deal for a lot of people. Maybe Natalie can address that to back me up on what I've said earlier.
Sure. Again, I think it comes down to who you're targeting. So certainly for certain platforms, you know, a Milkshake, for example, in the UK is a preschool channel. And, you know, so you want to be making sure that you are targeting them with the right age demographic for the show that you're pitching. Now, they might consider perhaps like a slightly older preschool, like an upper preschool with a sense of bridging. But if they're specifically preschool, then that's what you need to be doing. Again, you know, with something like a Cartoon Network, traditionally they've been much more like 6 to 10 focused, although they are now moving more into preschool focus now that they're expanding across with the HBO Max platform. So it's just about making sure that when you conceive your idea and you are at that point when your presentation materials are together and then you go to pitch the platforms, you are going in the knowledge of who you're pitching to and understanding who their audience are and the other shows that they've got on their channels. You know, Nickelodeon and a Cartoon Network, they're always going to want, you know, comedy first. That's the nature of the game. Whereas if you're going to go to a public service broadcaster, they're more likely to want more educational content when it comes to a preschool show. So it's just about making sure that you know that your content fits the partner you're approaching. Otherwise, it's a waste of time for everybody.
Well said, Natalie. And Edward's added another question about, is there a market for other genres aside from comedy for animation? Of course, you can have action adventure, but if it's funny, it helps big time. You know, and there's all sorts of different genres to be, but I was just talking about what's really popular, what broadcasters and platforms are looking for, and how important laughing and comedy and different types of comedy is to platforms and to kids, of course. And also comedy's become much more sophisticated over the past few years. You see screwball comedies, you see slapstick plus screwball, and all the very, very sophisticated comedies like Adventure Time, like Uncle Grandpa, that you can find on Cartoon Network and other channels. So comedy is sophisticated, so it's not just any type of comedy, but I think different genres, of course, there is a market and everybody wants to laugh, in addition to having a good time, being excited, being scared, all those other things.